Admiral Kim Tae-ho stood at the center of the massive Galactic Council chamber and felt the weight of 800 alien gazes upon him. The chamber itself stretched for kilometers in every direction, with floating platforms that held representatives from dozens of different worlds. Some aliens breathed methane and sat in glass bubbles, while others were made of pure energy and flickered like living stars. The translator devices hummed constantly as hundreds of different languages merged into a chaos of sound that somehow made sense to everyone present. Kim had been coming to these meetings for 20 years, but today felt different. Today, the air itself seemed heavy with judgment and fear. The human delegation sat on their assigned platform, which was positioned much lower than it had been in previous years. Dr. Park Mi-young sat to his left with her hands folded calmly, despite the tension that radiated from every alien in the chamber. Captain Lee Dong-min stood behind them both with his military uniform perfectly pressed and his face showing no emotion, even though Kim could see the young man's jaw muscles working with suppressed anger. The Vextar Prime Counselor Zenth rose from his platform, which was covered in what looked like metallic honeycomb structures. The insectoid alien was 3 meters tall with 4 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws and compound eyes that reflected the chamber's lights like broken mirrors. When Zenth spoke, his voice came through the translators as a series of clicks and buzzes that somehow formed words that every species could understand. "The human question has been debated for too long," Zenth announced, while his 4 arms gestured in patterns that Kim had learned meant extreme displeasure in Vextar body language. "Their colonies spread too fast and their military forces move. Without proper consultation with this council, they make decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and their unpredictable nature threatens the stability we have worked for thousands of years to achieve." Kim felt Dr. Park tense beside him, but the xenobiologist remained silent as they had agreed. The accusations were not new, but hearing them spoken with such finality in front of the entire galaxy made them feel like physical blows. Kim had spent decades trying to explain human nature to aliens who thought in ways so different from humans that true understanding seemed impossible. The ethereal speaker Vorth materialized on the highest platform in the chamber. The ancient energy being appeared as a shifting column of blue-white light that pulsed with each word it spoke. Vorth's species had been part of the galactic community for over 50,000 years, and their words carried more weight than any other voice in the chamber. "The humans have contributed much to our civilization," Vorth said in a voice that sounded like wind through crystal caves. "Their medical advances have saved billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. Their diplomatic solutions have prevented wars that could have destroyed entire star systems. Their courage in exploring dangerous regions of space has opened new worlds for colonization by many species." Kim felt a moment of hope, but then Vorth continued speaking, and that hope died as quickly as it had been born. "However," the ancient being said with what sounded like sadness, "their very nature makes them incompatible with long-term galactic stability. They adapt too quickly to new situations, which makes their behavior impossible to predict. They form emotional attachments that override logical decision-making processes. Most dangerous of all, they inspire other species to act more like humans, which threatens to destabilize the careful balance of our civilization." Dr. Park finally spoke up from her position beside Kim. "Honored Speaker Vorth, our research shows that diversity of thought and approach actually strengthens civilizations rather than weakening them. The galaxy has become more prosperous and more peaceful since humans joined the galactic community 50 years ago. Our different perspective allows us to solve problems that purely logical approaches cannot address." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien voices as hundreds of species began arguing at once. Some supported Dr. Park's position, while others demanded immediate action against the human threat. Kim watched as alliances that had taken decades to build began to crumble in real time. The aquatic Merdai, who had been close allies of humanity, were now speaking in favor of restrictions on human expansion. The silicon-based crystalline collective, who had never trusted humans, began calling for complete isolation of the human species. Captain Lee leaned forward and whispered urgently to Kim, "Admiral, the vote counters are already active. They're not even going to give us a chance to present our full defense." Kim nodded grimly as he watched the holographic displays that showed vote tallies updating in real time. The numbers were devastating. Species after species was voting to support the Vextar proposal for human exile. Even species that had benefited enormously from human assistance were voting against them out of fear of what humans might become rather than gratitude for what they had already accomplished. The final vote was announced by Zenth with what Kim suspected was satisfaction despite the aliens' inability to show facial expressions. 847 votes in favor of human exile, 12 votes opposed. The motion passes by the required supermajority. Kim stood slowly and looked around the chamber at aliens he had considered friends and allies for decades. Many of them refused to meet his gaze while others stared at him with what he interpreted as a mixture of fear and relief. Dr. Park placed her hand on his arm and squeezed gently. Captain Lee moved to stand directly behind him in a gesture of support that was probably the last act of human military presence that would ever be seen in this chamber. The human species has 50 standard galactic years to withdraw all colonies and military forces to their home system, Zenth continued. A barrier will be constructed around the Sol system to prevent any future human expansion into galactic space. This barrier will remain in place indefinitely to ensure the safety and stability of galactic civilization. Kim activated his personal communicator and spoke directly to the human fleet commanders who were waiting in ships just outside the neutral zone. Begin evacuation protocols immediately. All human personnel and assets are to be withdrawn to Sol system within the next 50 years. Leave nothing behind that could be used against us, but also leave nothing that could be used to justify further action against human civilians. As the human delegation prepared to leave the chamber for the last time, Kim noticed Captain Lee making subtle hand signals to someone in the observation galleries above. Kim pretended not to see this, but he suspected that young Lee was coordinating with human intelligence operatives who had been monitoring the proceedings. If humans were going to be exiled from galactic society, they would at least maintain the ability to observe what happened after their departure. The barrier activation ceremony took place exactly 50 years later on a cold morning in Earth's solar system. Kim was now an old man, but he insisted on being present as the last human transport ship crossed the boundary before the energy field activated. The barrier appeared as a shimmering wall of light that completely surrounded the Sol system and would prevent any human vessel from leaving or any alien vessel from entering. Captain Lee, who was now Admiral Lee, stood beside Kim on the observation deck of the transport ship and watched as their connection to the galaxy was severed forever. "What do you think will happen out there without us, Admiral?" Lee asked quietly. Kim smiled grimly as he watched the barrier solidify into an impenetrable wall of energy. "I think they're about to learn why evolution favored cooperation over isolation, but they'll figure that out on their own soon enough." Neither man noticed the small automated probes that had been left behind in the outer reaches of various star systems. Probes that would continue to watch and record everything that happened in the galaxy that had chosen to abandon humanity. Probes that would ensure that when the time came for humanity to return, they would know exactly what they were returning to. 50 years had passed since the humans disappeared behind their energy barrier, and the galaxy celebrated what historians were already calling the Serenity Period. Ambassador Theclon of the Vextar Collective stood on the observation deck of what had once been the human industrial world of New Harmony and felt deep satisfaction as he watched automated mining platforms extract rare minerals with perfect efficiency. The world had been transformed from a chaotic mix of human settlements and alien districts into a model of Vextar organizational principles where every structure served a specific purpose and every citizen followed predetermined schedules. The transformation had not been difficult once the humans were gone. Human technology was surprisingly simple to reverse engineer, and their industrial processes could be improved dramatically when emotional decision-making was removed from the equation. The Vextar had taken control of 17 former human worlds and turned them into the most productive mining and manufacturing centers in the galaxy. Production quotas were exceeded every quarter, and worker efficiency had increased by 43% since human management was eliminated. Trade Minister Gralvex of the Saurian Republic examined shipping manifests on his personal display, while standing in the central hub of what had been the human trade station New Singapore. The massive space station now processed twice as much cargo as it had under human management, thanks to Saurian bureaucratic efficiency and standardized procedures. Every transaction was recorded in triplicate, and every cargo container was inspected according to strict protocols that eliminated the chaos and unpredictability that had characterized human trading practices. The Saurian Republic had inherited control of the major trade routes that connected the galactic core to the outer rim territories. Under human management, these routes had been unprofitable for many shipping companies because humans insisted on providing emergency assistance to vessels in distress and maintaining expensive search and rescue operations that served no logical economic purpose. Saurian efficiency had eliminated these wasteful practices, and trade volumes had increased by 60%, while operational costs had decreased by 25%. Deep in space beyond the galactic rim where no alien sensors could detect. Dr. Ju Hyun-woo worked in a research facility that existed only because humans had been forced to become completely self-sufficient. The exile had pushed human science forward in ways that would never have been possible if they had remained integrated into galactic society. Without access to alien technology, humans had been forced to develop their own solutions to problems that they had previously solved through trade and cooperation. The breakthroughs had come rapidly once human scientists stopped trying to conform to galactic scientific standards and started thinking in purely human terms. Quantum mechanics research had advanced centuries beyond anything achieved by alien civilizations because human intuition allowed for conceptual leaps that purely logical thinking could not achieve. Biotechnology had exploded into new fields as human adaptability was applied to biological engineering in ways that specialized alien minds could never have conceived. Ju's current project involved something that alien scientists would have considered impossible because it required the kind of creative thinking that their rigid mental structures could not accommodate. He was developing technology that could manipulate space-time in ways that would allow human vessels to travel faster than any alien ship while remaining completely undetectable to conventional sensors. The theoretical framework had been developed by human physicists who approached the problem from angles that alien logic would never have permitted. Intelligence operative Kang So-ra monitored communications from her hidden station in the asteroid belt of a system that had once hosted a human listening post. The listening post had been destroyed when humans evacuated, but the automated systems that Kang now operated had been built into the asteroids themselves, where alien surveys would never detect them. She watched data streams from across the galaxy and compiled reports that painted a picture of growing instability that alien leaders either could not see or chose to ignore. The first serious problems had begun 3 years after human exile, when the Merchant Guild Wars erupted over control of shipping routes in the spiral arm sectors. Without human mediators to negotiate disputes between trading companies, the conflicts had escalated rapidly from economic competition to actual combat. The war had lasted 18 months and resulted in the destruction of 67 merchant vessels and the collapse of trade relationships that had existed for centuries. More concerning was the pattern that Kang observed in diplomatic communications between alien species. Without humans to serve as neutral intermediaries in negotiations, alien species were discovering that they could not effectively communicate with each other about complex issues. The crystalline collective and the aquatic Merdai had been arguing for 5 years about territorial boundaries in a system that humans would have resolved through a simple arbitration process in a matter of weeks. The root of the problem was becoming clear to human observers, even if alien civilizations remained blind to it. Each alien species had evolved highly specialized methods of thinking that made them extremely effective at solving certain types of problems, but completely unable to understand how other species approached those same problems. Humans had served as universal translators not just for language, but for thought patterns and problem-solving approaches. Ambassador Theclon received the first report of civil unrest on New Harmony 6 months after Kang filed her analysis of growing galactic tensions. The human workers who had remained on the planet after evacuation had initially adapted to Vexitar management, but their productivity had begun declining steadily as they struggled with management methods that ignored individual differences and emotional needs. Work stoppages had evolved into protests, and protests had become violent resistance to Vexitar authority. The Vexitar response was swift and logical. They increased security forces and implemented stricter schedules designed to eliminate the unpredictable behavior that was disrupting production quotas. The result was exactly what any human observer could have predicted, but which Vextar logic could not anticipate. The unrest spread to other worlds, as news of the crackdowns reached other former human colonies that were now under alien management. Trade Minister Gralvex faced different but equally serious problems as shipping companies that had operated successfully under human oversight began failing under Saurian management. The standardized procedures that had seemed so efficient were proving to be inflexible when dealing with the thousand small emergencies and unexpected situations that arose in interstellar commerce. Ships were stranded at stations because their cargo did not fit exact bureaucratic categories. Trade agreements collapsed because Saurian negotiators could not understand the cultural nuances that human traders had navigated instinctively. The real crisis began when an alien survey ship investigating unusual energy readings at the edge of human space simply vanished. The ship had been equipped with the most advanced sensors available to galactic civilization and carried a crew of the galaxy's best scientists. It had been sent to investigate reports of strange quantum fluctuations near the human barrier that suggested possible attempts to breach the containment field. The search fleet that was dispatched to find the missing vessel discovered only a debris field that contained pieces of the ship's hull arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that could not have occurred naturally. At the center of the debris field, they found a communication beacon that had been programmed to activate when alien ships approached. The message it contained was brief and spoken in Admiral Kim's voice, despite the fact that Kim had died 10 years earlier. "You should have let us help," the recording said in Kim's calm, measured tones. "The galaxy is more fragile than you realized, and more dependent on cooperation than you understood. We tried to warn you, but you chose fear over wisdom. Now you will learn what we could have taught you, if you had been willing to listen." The beacon's final transmission included detailed sensor data that showed the missing survey ship had not been destroyed by human weapons. Instead, it had been carefully disassembled by technology that operated on principles unknown to galactic science. The ship's crew had been extracted safely and transported to an unknown location beyond the reach of alien sensors. It was a demonstration of capability that no alien civilization could match, and a message that humanity was no longer the same species that had been exiled 50 years earlier. Dr. Ju received the report of the alien ship's capture with satisfaction, as he put the finishing touches on the quantum drive that would power humanity's return to galactic space. The exile had given humans time to evolve beyond the limitations that had made aliens fear them. Now they were returning not as the junior partners in galactic civilization, but as something entirely new. Kang's latest intelligence reports showed that the galaxy was approaching a crisis point that would soon make human intervention not just welcome but absolutely necessary for the survival of interstellar civilization. The galaxy burned in ways that no alien civilization had imagined possible when they voted to exile humanity 15 years earlier. Colonel Yoon Jae-sung watched from the bridge of his stealth ship as the former human world of New Prosperity descended into chaos below. The planet had been a model of interspecies cooperation under human administration, but under Vextar control, it had become a battleground where 3 different alien factions fought for control of the industrial complexes that produced starship components for half the galaxy. Yoon was the son of refugees who had been evacuated during the exile, and he had grown up hearing stories about the galaxy that humans had left behind. Those stories bore no resemblance to the war-torn civilization that he now observed through advanced sensors that no alien technology could detect. His ship was one of hundreds that operated beyond the edges of known space, using technology that had been developed during humanity's isolation. They moved through alien territory like ghosts, gathering intelligence, and occasionally intervening to prevent the complete collapse of worlds that still held human populations. Dr. Choi Yoon-ji studied psychological profiles of alien leaders from her research station hidden in the Outer Rim and tried to understand how galactic civilization had deteriorated so rapidly. Her analysis showed that the problem was not military or economic, but psychological. Alien species had evolved to think in highly specialized ways that made them extremely effective within their areas of expertise, but completely unable to adapt when circumstances changed. Humans had served as cognitive bridges between different ways of thinking, and without those bridges, alien civilizations were discovering that they could not understand each other well enough to maintain peaceful relationships. The Cascade Wars had begun 3 years earlier when a simple trade dispute between the Saurian Republic and the Crystalline Collective had escalated into armed conflict because neither species could understand how the other approached the concept of property ownership. Under human mediation, such disputes had been resolved through careful explanation of cultural differences and patient negotiation of compromise solutions. Without human mediators, the misunderstanding had grown into accusations of theft and fraud. That led to military action. The war had spread as other species took sides based on their own economic interests rather than any understanding of the original dispute. The aquatic Merdai had supported the Saurians because they needed Saurian technology for their underwater cities. The Energy Being Consortium had allied with the Crystalline Collective because they shared similar non-biological perspectives on existence. Each alliance created new tensions with species that felt threatened by the growing power blocks. General Krextar of the Vextar Collective stood in his command center on the former human world of New Beijing and struggled to understand why his forces could not maintain order despite their overwhelming technological superiority. The human populations on worlds under Vextar control had initially accepted alien rule, but their behavior had become increasingly unpredictable as Vextar management methods created problems that Vextar logic could not solve. The industrial world of New Harmony had been evacuated after worker riots destroyed half the manufacturing facilities. The mining world of New Johannesburg had declared independence and was somehow managing to defend itself against Vextar military forces using improvised weapons and tactics that violated every principle of logical warfare. Most disturbing of all, the agricultural world of New Kansas had simply stopped producing food and was demanding the return of human administrators who understood how to balance industrial efficiency with the psychological needs of sentient workers. Krextar had been trained in the finest Vextar military academies and had studied the strategies and tactics of a dozen different species, but nothing in his education had prepared him for opponents who did not behave according to logical principles. Human populations under his control made decisions based on emotions and cultural factors that Vextar analysis could not predict or counter. They formed alliances based on personal relationships rather than strategic interests, and they fought with desperate creativity that overcame superior firepower through sheer unpredictability. High Arbitrator Melthera of the Ethereal Council materialized in the emergency session chamber where representatives from across the galaxy had gathered to address the crisis that threatened to destroy interstellar civilization. The ancient energy being had lived through the rise and fall of dozens of galactic civilizations, but had never seen a collapse happen so quickly or so completely. The situation has moved beyond our ability to control through traditional diplomatic methods, Melthera announced to the assembled representatives. The psychological analysis prepared by the Xenopsychology Institute confirms that the removal of humanity from galactic society has created cognitive gaps that our species cannot bridge independently. We require external assistance to restore stability. The chamber erupted in the familiar chaos of alien voices as species that could barely communicate with each other attempted to debate solutions to problems they could not properly understand. The Vextar demanded military solutions that would impose order through force. The Saurians proposed bureaucratic reforms that would create standardized procedures for managing interspecies conflicts. The Crystalline Collective suggested technological approaches that would eliminate the need for biological emotions in decision-making. None of the proposed solutions addressed the fundamental problem that Dr. Choi had identified in her research. Alien species were discovering that they had become dependent on human cognitive abilities without realizing it. Humans served as universal translators who could understand multiple ways of thinking and find common ground between approaches that seemed completely incompatible. Without that translation, capability alien civilizations were fragmenting into isolated groups that could not cooperate effectively. Colonel Yoon received emergency communications from human intelligence networks on 17 different worlds where alien governments were losing control of their own populations. The former human colonies were particularly unstable because the populations had been accustomed to management styles that took individual differences and cultural factors into account. Alien administrators who tried to impose rigid logical systems on diverse populations were creating psychological stress that manifested as civil unrest and economic disruption. The most serious situation was developing on the former human diplomatic center of New Geneva, where representatives from 47 species had gathered for an emergency peace conference. Without human diplomats to facilitate communication between radically different thought patterns, the conference had devolved into a series of separate meetings where each species tried to negotiate bilateral agreements that contradicted arrangements being made simultaneously with other species. Yoon's mission was to extract human civilian populations from the most dangerous conflict zones before the situation deteriorated further. His ships could move undetected through alien space using quantum drive technology that bent space-time around them, making them invisible to conventional sensors. The extraction operations revealed the extent of the collapse, as human refugees described worlds where basic services had failed because alien administrators could not adapt their procedures to handle unexpected situations. Dr. Choi's latest psychological profile of galactic leadership showed that alien species were trapped in cognitive patterns that prevented them from recognizing their own limitations. Each species believed that their way of thinking was superior to others, and that the current crisis was caused by other species refusing to adopt obviously correct approaches to problem solving. None of them could see that the problem was not a lack of logical thinking, but an absence of the cognitive flexibility that humans provided. The breaking point came when the Galactic Council attempted to send a formal request for assistance to human space. The message was transmitted through the barrier using quantum communication technology that had been developed by the Crystalline Collective specifically for this purpose. The response came back within hours and was broadcast simultaneously to every government center and news network in the galaxy. Admiral Kim's voice spoke from beyond the grave as artificial intelligence systems that had been programmed with his personality patterns delivered humanity's answer to the galaxy's desperate plea for help. The vote was 847 to 12. The decision was made by species who believed they could maintain galactic civilization without human participation. That decision stands until the galaxy demonstrates that it has learned from the consequences of its choice. The message continued with detailed analysis of the failures that had led to the current crisis. Human observers had documented every diplomatic failure, every economic collapse, and every military conflict that had resulted from the absence of human cognitive bridging capabilities. The galaxy had been offered the chance to learn from its mistakes and would be given the opportunity to prove that it had gained the wisdom necessary for humans to consider returning to galactic society. The barrier around human space deactivated without warning on a Tuesday morning that would be remembered as the day galactic civilization learned the true meaning of technological evolution. Fleet Admiral Park Jin-ho stood on the bridge of the flagship Indomitable Spirit and watched as his fleet of 3,000 vessels emerged from the quantum fields that had hidden them from alien sensors for the past 70 years. The ships that appeared at the edge of former human territory bore no resemblance to the vessels that had retreated behind the barrier decades earlier. The human fleet moved through space using principles that alien physics could not explain. Ships that should have been impossible to build based on known materials, science hung in formation like living things that breathed energy and exhaled gravitational waves. The hulls seemed to shift and flow as if they were made of liquid metal that had been convinced to hold solid shapes through sheer force of will. Energy signatures that no alien sensor could identify pulsed through the fleet like the heartbeat of some vast cosmic organism. President Luxandra of the Reformed Galactic Council received the first reports of humanity's return while she was reviewing casualty estimates from the latest phase of the Cascade Wars. The numbers were staggering. 17 species were engaged in active military conflicts with each other, while 23 more provided material support to various factions. Industrial production across the galaxy had collapsed to levels not seen since the early days of interstellar civilization. Trade routes that had operated safely for thousands of years were now controlled by pirates and warlords who recognized no galactic authority. The message from Fleet Admiral Park arrived through communication channels that the Reformed Galactic Council did not know existed. The transmission appeared simultaneously on every screen in the council chambers and spoke directly to each representative in their native language, while somehow maintaining the exact same meaning across radically different linguistic structures. It was a demonstration of communication technology that surpassed anything in the galactic database. I am Fleet Admiral Park Jin-ho representing the returning human civilization. The message began in Park's calm, confident voice. We have observed the current state of galactic affairs and determined that intervention is necessary to prevent the complete collapse of interstellar society. However, our intervention will proceed according to human terms and human timelines. The galaxy that chose to exile us no longer has the authority to dictate the conditions of our return. Director Nam Yu-jin coordinated the intelligence operation that revealed the full extent of human preparation during their isolation. Hidden monitoring stations throughout the galaxy activated simultaneously and began transmitting data that showed humans had been watching and analyzing every aspect of alien civilization for 70 years. The depth and accuracy of human intelligence was overwhelming. They knew the personal habits of alien leaders, the weaknesses in military formations, the inefficiencies in economic systems, and the psychological pressure points that could be used to influence decision-making. The intelligence operation also revealed that humanity had not simply been hiding behind their barrier, but had been actively recruiting allies from among the populations of former human worlds. Humans who had remained in alien space during the exile had formed underground networks that now controlled key infrastructure systems on dozens of worlds. When human forces began their intervention, these networks activated and provided support. That made human operations incredibly effective. Captain Shin Hai-won commanded the first diplomatic mission to the Vextar homeworld, where General Krextar was struggling to maintain control of his military forces in the face of widespread rebellion on former human colonies. Her ship materialized in orbit around the Vextar capital without triggering any of the defensive systems that should have detected her approach. The technology that allowed such complete stealth operations was based on principles that Vextar science could not begin to understand. The meeting between Captain Shin and General Krextar took place in the Vextar Command Center, where holographic displays showed the deteriorating situation across Vextar territory. Krextar had been prepared for traditional negotiations based on exchanges of territorial concessions and trade agreements, but Captain Shin offered something completely different. The solution to your problems is not military or economic, but psychological, Shin explained while accessing Vextar computer systems through interfaces that should have been secure against outside intrusion. Your species evolved to excel at logical analysis and systematic organization, but you cannot understand beings who think in different patterns. The populations under your control are not rebelling against your authority, but against management methods that ignore their psychological needs. Within 6 hours, Captain Shin had resolved territorial disputes that had been causing instability on Vextar worlds for over a decade. She did this not through traditional diplomacy, but by analyzing the psychological patterns of different species and designing administrative systems that worked with their natural thought processes rather than against them. The solutions were so elegant and obvious once explained that Krextar wondered why Vextar analysts had never conceived of them independently. The answer was that Vextar thinking was too specialized to make the cognitive leaps necessary for understanding species with completely different mental structures. Humans possessed a flexibility of thought that allowed them to understand multiple ways of thinking simultaneously and translate between them in ways that other species could not match. This ability had been amplified during their isolation as human scientists studied alien psychology with an intensity and focus that would not have been possible while participating in galactic society. Fleet. Admiral Park established temporary command centers on 17 former human worlds, where local populations had requested direct human intervention. The speed and efficiency of human peacekeeping operations surprised even alien observers who remembered human capabilities from before the exile. Conflicts that had raged for years were resolved in days through combinations of advanced technology, psychological insight, and administrative innovations that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. The most impressive demonstration occurred on the former trade hub of New Singapore, where human administrators restored full economic function within 2 weeks of taking control. The station had been operating at 12% capacity under Saurian management because bureaucratic procedures could not adapt to the dynamic requirements of interstellar commerce. Human managers implemented flexible systems that could adjust automatically to changing conditions while maintaining the record-keeping and safety standards that interstellar trade required. Director. Nam revealed the strategic framework that guided human intervention operations during a briefing session with alien leaders who had requested human assistance. The framework was based on detailed psychological profiles of every major alien species and political entity in the galaxy. Humans had used their years of isolation to develop a complete understanding of alien cognitive patterns that allowed them to predict behavior and design solutions that worked with alien psychology rather than against it. The framework also included contingency plans for every possible scenario that could arise during the intervention process. Humans had learned from their previous experience in galactic society and were prepared for resistance, collaboration, or any combination of responses from alien civilizations. Their planning was so thorough and their technology so advanced that they could afford to be patient and methodical in their approach to galactic stabilization. President Luxandra found herself in the unprecedented position of formally requesting that humanity assume leadership of galactic civilization. The request was made not from a position of strength, but from the desperate recognition that alien species could not maintain interstellar society without human cognitive bridging capabilities. The galaxy had tried to function without humans, and had proven that it lacked the psychological flexibility necessary for managing complex interspecies relationships. Fleet Admiral Park's response to the request was delivered during a ceremony broadcast to every world in the galaxy. Standing before representatives of hundreds of species, he announced humanity's conditions for accepting leadership of galactic civilization. The conditions were not territorial or economic, but psychological and administrative. Alien species would retain full autonomy within their own territories, but would accept human arbitration for all interspecies disputes and human management of interspecies institutions. The galaxy chose isolation over cooperation 70 years ago, Park said in the address that would become known as the Declaration of Return. That choice led directly to the current crisis and proved that fear of human differences was less dangerous than the absence of human capabilities. We return not as conquerors seeking territory or resources, but as healers offering the gift of cognitive integration that your civilizations require for survival. The ceremony concluded with the activation of new human technologies that would monitor and maintain galactic stability through methods that alien science could not duplicate or counter. High Chancellor Baek Soo-min stood before the assembled representatives of the reformed Galactic Council and reflected on how completely the galaxy had changed in the single year since humanity's return. The chamber itself had been redesigned, according to human psychological principles that promoted cooperation rather than competition. Instead of the hierarchical arrangement of platforms that had characterized the old council, the new chamber featured circular discussion areas where representatives from different species could interact naturally without the symbolic barriers that had previously reinforced isolation and mistrust. The transformation had been more profound than anyone had expected, including the humans who had planned the intervention. Alien species that had been locked in seemingly irreconcilable conflicts for decades had discovered that their disputes were based on misunderstandings that could be resolved once human mediators provided accurate translation between different ways of thinking. The Cascade Wars had ended not through military victory or economic pressure, but through patient explanation of how different species approached concepts like territory ownership and resource allocation. Marshal Kim Do-hyun reviewed reports from the Human Peacekeeping Corps that showed the success of the new approach to galactic security. Traditional peacekeeping had relied on military force to suppress conflicts after they began, but human peacekeeping prevented conflicts by addressing the psychological and cultural factors that created tensions between species. Peacekeeping teams included not just soldiers but also psychologists, linguists, and cultural specialists who could identify potential problems before they escalated into violence. The most successful innovation was the early warning system that used human psychological analysis to predict where interspecies tensions might develop. The system monitored communication patterns between alien governments and identified signs of the cognitive disconnects that had previously led to diplomatic failures. When potential problems were detected, human mediators were deployed to facilitate communication before misunderstandings could grow into larger conflicts. Ambassador Lee Ye-rim managed the new diplomatic protocols that had revolutionized interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. The protocols were based on the recognition that different species had fundamentally different ways of processing information and making decisions. Instead of expecting all species to conform to universal diplomatic standards, the new system provided specialized approaches for each type of alien psychology while maintaining consistency in outcomes and objectives. The breakthrough had come when human researchers realized that alien species were not simply different cultures, but represented different forms of consciousness that required different types of interaction. The logical thought patterns of species, like the Vextar, needed clear systematic presentations of information, while the intuitive consciousness of species like the Energy Being Consortium responded better to symbolic and metaphorical communication. Humans served as cognitive translators who could present the same information in ways that each species could understand and accept. Professor Oh Seung-ho directed the Interspecies Understanding Institute that had become the most important educational institution in the galaxy. The institute trained both human diplomats and alien administrators in the psychological principles that made effective interspecies cooperation possible. The curriculum included detailed study of how different forms of consciousness processed information and made decisions, along with practical exercises in cognitive translation and cultural mediation. The institute also conducted ongoing research into alien psychology that continued to reveal new insights into the nature of consciousness and intelligence. Human researchers had discovered that intelligence took many more forms than had been previously recognized, and that the diversity of thinking patterns in the galaxy was actually a tremendous resource that could be harnessed through proper understanding and coordination. Each species brought unique cognitive capabilities that could solve problems that other forms of thinking could not address. The economic transformation had been as dramatic as the political changes. Trade volumes had increased by 300% as human administrators eliminated the inefficiencies that had developed during the period of alien-only management. The key insight was that interstellar commerce required constant adaptation to changing conditions and unexpected situations that rigid bureaucratic systems could not handle effectively. Human managers implemented flexible protocols that could adjust automatically while maintaining the security and record-keeping that interstellar trade required. The former human world of New Singapore had become the model for the new approach to trade administration. The space station now processed more cargo than any other facility in the galaxy, while maintaining perfect safety records and eliminating the corruption that had plagued alien-managed trade centers. The success was based on human understanding of how to balance efficiency with adaptability and how to design systems that worked with alien psychology rather than against it. Marshal Kim received reports that showed crime rates had dropped to historic lows across the galaxy as human peacekeeping methods addressed the root causes of social problems rather than simply responding to their symptoms. The reduction in crime was particularly dramatic on former human worlds, where alien administrators had unknowingly created psychological stress that manifested as antisocial behavior. Human administrators understood that different species had different social needs and designed governance systems that supported psychological health rather than undermining it. The transformation was most visible in the educational systems that human advisors had helped redesign throughout the galaxy. Traditional alien education had focused on training individuals to fit into predetermined social roles, but human-influenced. Education emphasized developing the natural capabilities of each individual, regardless of species. The result was a generation of young aliens who could think more flexibly and communicate more effectively with members of other species. High Chancellor Bayek announced the completion of the new Galactic Constitution during a ceremony that was broadcast to every world in the galaxy. The Constitution formally recognized that effective interspecies cooperation required human cognitive mediation and established the legal framework for the human hegemony that would govern galactic civilization. The document was unique in galactic history because it was the first governing framework that took into account the psychological differences between species rather than assuming that all intelligent beings could be governed by the same methods. The Constitution established 3 levels of authority in galactic society. Individual species retained complete autonomy within their own territories and could govern themselves according to their own cultural and psychological preferences. Interspecies institutions and activities were managed by human administrators who had the cognitive flexibility necessary to coordinate between different forms of consciousness. The overall direction of galactic civilization was determined through cooperative processes that included input from all species, but with humans serving as facilitators and interpreters. Ambassador Lee presented the statistical analysis that demonstrated the success of the new system. Diplomatic disputes between species had decreased by 95% since human mediators began facilitating interspecies communication. Trade conflicts had been eliminated entirely through the implementation of flexible protocols that could accommodate the different ways that various species approached commercial relationships. Military conflicts between council member species had ended completely as human peacekeepers addressed the psychological roots of interspecies tensions. Professor O released research findings that explained why the human approach to galactic governance was so successful. The research showed that consciousness itself was more diverse than had been previously understood, and that the galaxy contained dozens of fundamentally different ways of processing information and making decisions. Humans possessed a unique form of consciousness that combined multiple thinking patterns and could serve as interpreters between forms of awareness that could not communicate directly with each other. The research also revealed that the diversity of consciousness in the galaxy was not a source of conflict, but a tremendous resource for solving complex problems. Each form of alien consciousness could approach problems from angles that other species could not conceive and could find solutions that purely logical or purely intuitive thinking could not reach. Human cognitive bridging allowed the galaxy to harness this diversity for the first time in its history. High Chancellor Baek concluded the ceremony by announcing the establishment of the Galactic Cooperation Day that would be celebrated annually to commemorate the transformation of galactic civilization. The holiday would honor not the human conquest of the galaxy, but the successful integration of diverse forms of consciousness into a cooperative society that was stronger and more creative than any single species could achieve independently. The final scene of the ceremony showed children from dozens of different species playing together in a park on the former human world of New Geneva.